Hello. Hello, it's Julia. It's April Fool's Day. It's the 1st of April. I hope very much that you have resisted the urge to play some awful tricks on your parents. I didn't remind my children that it was April Fool's Day. I didn't really want them to remember. I was having a quick look online earlier on because I suddenly remembered yesterday that New Year's Day used to be something like the 25th of March. I was saying to somebody that I was making New Year's resolutions, and I thought, well, they almost are New Year's resolutions. If we were on a Tudor calendar, it comes up in the third book in the Scargatherer series, the Falconer's Quarry. So yes, New Year's Day, end of March. April Fool's Day has been done for hundreds of years, 1683 or something like that. So it has a long and noble history. Anyway, I hope you haven't played any pranks on your family today. My husband has just bought my son a chanter, which is, hang on a minute, let me just get it. Okay, this is it. It's the bit that you, if I hold it a bit further back you can see it. It's the bit that you make the horrible noise on the bagpipe when you haven't got the bags. So yeah, I thought that is very typical of my husband, that he should decide to buy something like this, which frankly needs to be used with nobody anywhere nearby. I'm not even sure if I can get a sound out of it. It's got finger holes. Yeah, that was pretty antisocial, I think, to buy somebody in the household something like that. But anyway, my son is pleased that he can use it because he's still got these stitches in his hand from when he put the machete into it, like I mentioned to you the other day. So he's pleased that he can use that because he can't play his oboe. Anyway, other than that, around the house today, smallest person is doing Lego in the attic, listening to probably the 6th hour of Harry Potter being read by Stephen Fry. We gave that to him for his birthday, and he hasn't come out of the attic since, really, or scarcely. My husband's still hunkered down in my study, so I'm still in the kitchen, although I've changed position slightly to make it a bit less bright behind me. And middle son has just grabbed his tablet, I notice now I think about it. He just came past me and he was being slightly sneaky. Funny that. He knew that probably I wouldn't be paying attention. That's very much his style. Anyway, there we are. So, we're on chapter 11. Chapter 11. A ship has just come in and there's this huge feast about to happen. Joe doesn't know yet what the feast is about. Lucy's gone off to the baths with her sisters and her mother and the other women in the morning, and Joe can't go because he's a boy. He's going to have to go in the afternoon. And there's this feast coming up, and there's a ship that's come in, and a very, very large and very clearly very heavy crate has gone past with a lot of slaves carrying it that keeps making odd noises. And while he was watching that, was it before he was watching it? After he was watching that, Tiberius has approached. And he is clearly really serious trouble for Joe. Okay, chapter 11. Joe kept away from the palace buildings for the rest of the morning. He was fairly sure that Tiberius wouldn't pick on him again, at least for a day or two, but he was too worn out to make conversation with anyone else. Lucy didn't emerge from the baths until midday, and then she was unusually quiet. Joe wondered if she was still cross with him, but she'd never stayed cross for more than a few seconds before, and she wasn't unfriendly, just wrapped up in her own thoughts. After they'd eaten their midday meal, he decided to go to the bathhouse immediately himself, since Lucy wasn't in the mood to go and do anything. He could have waited for Petrus to finish whatever he was doing, but this was one of the only day-to-day experiences left where everyone would assume that he knew what to do, and he didn't want to have to hide his ignorance from Lucy's brother. He ought to be able to manage on his own, he thought, as long as nobody was watching him too carefully. After the experience he'd had going to the loo when he was first here, he'd made sure that he looked at the descriptions of bathing while he was back at home. And even though the books didn't seem to agree on the order for using the different rooms of the bathhouse, he had a fair idea of what to expect. As he took his clothes off in the changing area, he thought of himself reading about this last week. It seemed so far away, as though it had been a different life. It was weird to imagine Sam still asleep on the sofa bed in Dad's sitting room. Was his own body also there, he wondered, lying next to his brother? What would happen if Dad came into the room and woke them? Would he be hauled back into his own time? But Dad just walking into the room would take a number of seconds, and if this was like last time, he shouldn't be away even for that long. Abruptly, he felt worried. What if the time thing worked differently to how he'd thought? He'd been assuming that time stood still at home while he was here. But what if there was some kind of ratio between Lucy's time and his own? What if each of Lucy's hours was a second in his own time? When he was here in Lucy's world before, it had been for less than 24 hours. He could easily have been away from his own world for 24 seconds without knowing. But he'd been here now for 4 nights and 5 days. How many hours was that? How many seconds of absence? It could be enough that his dad might notice if he came into the sitting room. And then what exactly would he notice? That Joe wasn't there? Or that he didn't respond to anything around him? At least it was still night time, he hoped. In any case, there was nothing to be done about it at the moment. He took off his underclothes and made himself concentrate on what he was doing. According to all the books, the Romans went into the baths naked. But even though there was nobody around, he felt uncomfortable wearing nothing at all. At the end of the room, he spied some shelves of towels. Gratefully, he took one and wrapped it round his waist. There were wooden sandals on the rack beneath. He didn't remember anything about those from the books, but he took a pair anyway. They were hard and didn't really fit on his feet. When he walked, they clopped against the floor. He wondered whether he'd been wrong to come without Petrus. He'd assumed that there would be someone here already that he could watch to see what he was supposed to do. But the place was empty. Of course, if the slaves didn't use the baths, which he supposed they probably didn't, there couldn't be all that many men in the palace who would come here. Still, if there was nobody else around, it didn't matter that there was no one to copy, because there was no one to see if he got it all wrong either. He went through to the first room. It was small, cold, and dark, lit only by the daylight that filtered in through 2 small windows below the domed ceiling. He found that he was surprised. He shook his head at himself. He should be used to indoor darkness by now. Every room in the palace was darker than rooms at home, because the windows were always so small and dirty. And there was no electric light. But of course all the pictures he'd seen of baths were either drawings, in which everything was nice and bright, or photographs of ruins, where the roof or some of the walls had disappeared. He looked around. There were alcoves in the walls on either side, where he imagined you might sit if you wanted to be in cool darkness. Set in the floor directly in front of him was a circular pool, carved in stone, with a step all the way around. Joe kicked off his sandals and unwrapped the towel. He wasn't sure whether he was supposed to go right into the water, so he sat down on the edge of the pool and dipped his feet in. It was icy. He winced. There was no way he was going to get right in, even if that was what you were supposed to do. He made himself hold his feet in the water and gritted his teeth while he splashed his body all over. This was horrible. He huddled the towel around his body, shuffled into his sandals. and went through to the next room. This one was much bigger and had a large... What? I'm not sure. Oh, a large square pool in the middle. It was lighter too, with more windows and candlelight flickering on the walls. Best of all, it was warm. Joe breathed a sigh of relief as he stepped down into the pool and let himself slide backwards into the water. It was like having a hot bath in something the size of a swimming pool. He allowed himself to swoosh lazily around, watching the steam rise from the surface of the water. "There you are!" Joe flicked round towards the voice. It was Petrus. "I thought I might find you here. Have you been in the caldarium?" Joe paddled himself into an upright position, flustered by the question. Which was the caldarium? He watched Petrus's face for a clue. The other boy's eyes flicked towards a room he hadn't been into. "No, not yet," he said as coolly as he could. "We usually go in there before we bathe." "Oh, I see." Joe thought perhaps he'd better apologise. "Sorry." "Never mind." Petrus nodded towards the doorway. "Come on, we'll come back in here in a bit." Reluctantly, Joe swam to the side of the pool and got out. He felt self-conscious that he wasn't wearing anything, but Petrus didn't seem bothered. The room they went into was dark and roasting hot. Joe kicked off his sandals. The soles of his feet smarted against the burning hot floor. He scuffed the sandals hastily back on, struggling all the while for breath. The air was somehow incredibly thick. It pressed against his chest. Petrus poured water from a jug onto a bank of tiles at the end of the room. Steam filled the air. It felt like a knife at the back of Joe's throat. He wheezed and coughed. "The Laconium is next door. Would you prefer that?" Petrus asked. "Yes, please," croaked Joe. He couldn't remember what the Laconium involved, but it had to be better than this. The room next door was similarly hot and dark, and barely bigger than a cupboard. Joe kept his sandals on this time, and took shallow breaths. But although the heat was intense, it was dry and didn't hurt his throat as it had done in the steam room. He and Petrus sat silently side by side on their towels on the stone bench. He felt sweat breaking out all over his body. "That's enough," Petrus said after a few minutes. "It's not good to stay too long." Back in the room with the warm pool, he took a bottle from a shelf and poured something into the palm of his hand. "Here," he said, holding out the bottle. Joe recognised the smell. It was olive oil. He copied Petrus, dipping his fingertips in his palm and rubbing the oil over his skin. "It's always surprising how cool it feels out here after the hot rooms," Petrus said. Joe nodded. Petrus took 2 pieces of metal from a basket on the shelf. "Have a strigil," he said, handing one of them to Joe. Joe took it nonchalantly, as he had done the wax tablet and stylus when they'd had their first lesson together. It still seemed strange, actually using the kinds of objects he'd only seen behind the glass of museum cases. This one was a kind of half-hook, where the curved end had been beaten flat, like the blade of a knife. Joe imitated Petrus, using the edge of his blade to scrape his skin where he'd oiled it. The sensation was surprisingly pleasant, and despite plastering himself with oil, he did feel cleaner too. "Let's bathe," Petrus said, when they'd finished. He put the strigils back in the basket and took a running jump into the pool, curling his legs up and wrapping his arms around them. Joe hooted with laughter. "No bombing," he shouted as Petrus surfaced. "No what?" "Never mind." Joe jumped into the pool. He hadn't slipped out by saying anything as un-Roman as that the whole time he'd been here. He swam under the water as far as he could before he bobbed up. Petrus was standing on the side, about to jump in again. "I didn't think you were allowed to jump in like that," Joe said. Petrus grinned. "Not in public baths, and not if there was anyone else here. But who's going to know?" He spread his arms wide in a grand shrug, then dived into the water. They didn't get out until nearly supper time. On their way back through the frigidarium, Petrus said, "One last thing, a quick dip in here. It's good for you." He plunged into the cold pool. "Ow, that is freezing!" he howled. He pulled himself out onto the side, panting. "Your turn." Joe took a deep breath and jumped in. The cold hit him like a rock. He felt his limbs spasm. His brain seemed to empty. Everything went dark. It was very quiet. "This is it," he thought. "Either I'm going to die, or I'm going to be pulled back home right in front of Petrus." But the next thing he knew, Petrus was dragging him up onto the side. "Are you all right?" His face was white. "You stopped moving. I thought you... I don't know. I thought you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Joe rolled over on the floor. It was cold, but nothing like as cold as the water. "It's fine," he mumbled. "I thought I was going, but I'm fine." His teeth started to chatter. Petrus threw a towel over him. "Come on, let's get dressed. You need to get warm." But Joe was still shivering when they left the bathhouse. "I'm sorry," Petrus said. "I shouldn't have made you do that." "Never mind," Joe said, trying to hold his jaw steady while he spoke. "I'll be okay." "Okay? I'll be all right." Quite suddenly, another wave of homesickness swept over Joe. It was too much, keeping up the pretense, remembering not to say okay, trying all the time to guess what would happen next so that he didn't put his foot in it. He couldn't imagine ever being warm again either. If he were at home, Mum would give him extra jumpers and tuck him up under a duvet with a hot water bottle. He turned his head away so that Petrus wouldn't see him blinking back tears. The hollow in the pit of his stomach continued most of the way through supper. Joe ate what he could, but said nothing. As the food started at last to warm him up, he noticed that nobody else was speaking much either. He tried to catch Lucy's eye, but she didn't lift her gaze from her plate. Celestia stared at the floor and ate nothing at all, while Antonia sat between them, glancing anxiously back and forth. The boys talked a little, and Lucy's father made a pronouncement from time to time. Lucy's mother gazed into the distance and didn't reply. When the children were finally allowed to leave the room, Joe caught Lucy's sleeve as she walked out. "What's the matter?" he whispered. "What's going on?" She looked up at him. The expression on her face was bleak. "Sorry, Joe. I didn't realise today would be like this." Joe looked round quickly to see if anyone had heard her say his real name, but there was no one close by. Lucy seemed completely unaware. "It's Celestia," she said. "The feast, tomorrow. It's to celebrate her marriage." Joe frowned. "I thought you said nothing had been arranged for her." "It hadn't," Lucy said, "but there was a betrothal agreed while our cousins were here in August. I didn't know." She hung her head. "Is she marrying one of your cousins then?" "No, the stepson of one of my uncles." "Is it really that bad?" She nodded. "Why?" "Oh, Joe!" Lucy flung her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder. "He's awful," she sobbed. "He's horribly ugly. He has these nasty pustules all over his face. I know he can't help it, but you don't even want to look at him. But worse than that, he's really mean, like Tiberius, only even nastier." She wailed. Joe patted her awkwardly on the back. "Why does Celestia have to marry him? Couldn't they find someone else? After all, she's pretty and nice and well educated, as well as your father's daughter. That's just it. Lucy let go of him and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. It's a political match. His father was a senator in Rome, and his mother is from one of the great families of Rome. It makes sense. She sniffed and swallowed another sob. What does Celestia think? She hates him. Doesn't that count for something? Lucy shook her head. Her eyes brimmed over again with tears. Nobody cares what Celestia wants. This is what she has to do. That's how it is. She covered her face with her hands. It's so unfair. Oh, Joe, it's so unfair. Her voice rose in a wail. I've been thinking all day how I don't want to be here. I don't want to see Celestia marry him. Her shoulders shook. Joe put his arms cautiously around her. I want to go away from here, she sobbed. I want to go to wherever it is you come from. I want to come and live with you. So it's the end of chapter 11. We now know what the feast is for. The feast is for Celestia's marriage. And remember, she is only 13, isn't she? I think she's not yet 14. Lucy told us at the beginning of the book a bit earlier on. So she's a child still, but she's got to marry this man who is really, really unpleasant. And she has no choice in that. She has no say in the matter at all because it is a political liaison. It's somebody chosen by her family for the right reasons. So Lucy feels very sick about this, and of course what happens to Celestia could easily happen to Lucy in a few years' time, which would be just terrible. Anyway, that's the end of chapter 11. I'll be back tomorrow, same time, so 2 o'clock tomorrow for chapter 12. We're getting through the book, we really are. Chapter 12 tomorrow, 2 o'clock. In the meantime, don't play any more tricks on your parents for April Fool's Day because it's after noon, and from noon onwards you're not allowed. So, if I put the idea into your head at the beginning of this video, then it's too late. Ha! Right, that's it.